Wind worried the sage and made the valley sound like something breathing in its sleep. In the late afternoon, dust hung between the telegraph poles that the railroad men were driving into the ground, still thin and tentative, like they weren't sure the land would accept them. Elias Rourke watched from the porch step of his homestead. 2 rooms, a leaning shed, a corral that needed mending, and a garden that survived only because he worked it with stubborn hands. He had learned to read weather the way other men read books. When the sky went copper and the wind came from the west with that peculiar grit, it meant the riverbeds would go low by morning, and the cattle would chew at fence posts if he didn't keep them busy. Hard living made room for certain thoughts to harden too. Elias was not a cruel man by nature. His cruelty, such as it was, had always been practical. He'd buried things he couldn't afford to lose, and he'd turned away from people who expected gentleness without earning it. Still, he felt a prickling in his chest whenever he heard the railroad company's survey crews talk about clearing the way. They spoke about land like it was an unclaimed sheet of paper, blank except where their ink would go. On the far side of the wash, the survey men had tied a bright ribbon to a stake. The ribbon fluttered like a warning flag in a war no one admitted was coming. That evening, Elias rode out with a lantern and checked the eastern fence line. He'd found loose wire, a sagging post, and a set of hoof prints that didn't belong to his horses. The tracks were fresh enough that he could still see the sharpness of them, and that bothered him. Strangers got themselves into a frontier man's life the same way tumbleweeds got into a wagon wheel. Quietly at first, then all at once. When he returned, the sky had gone the color of old tin. He fed his horse and tightened the tack, then stood a while longer in the dim light with his hands resting on the saddle horn. Somewhere out past the last cluster of cottonwoods, the railroad crew's wagon rumbled along the track they'd started carving. It sounded like a distant engine that wanted to be close. Before he could decide whether to lock his door, he heard something else, smaller, more human. A faint scrape of leather against stone, then a soft cough. Elias's heart gave the smallest stumble. He stepped off the porch and listened. He found her near the spring house, just beyond where the lamplight reached. At first he thought it was a trick of dusk, a shape too dark to be a shadow, too still to be an animal. Then she moved, not with the quickness of a cattle thief, but with the slow carefulness of someone who had already spent too much strength running. Hattie Shaw sat half on the bank, half on the dry weeds. Her shawl had collected burrs, and there were faint streaks of dust on her cheekbone like she'd been dragged or kissed by a bad wind. One arm hung close to her body, and Elias couldn't see much of it under the cloth, but he saw the way she held herself, like pain had taught her to guard every breath. He didn't call out. He didn't approach all at once. He took 2 slow steps, keeping his weight even, and let his voice come soft. "Evening," Elias said. "You lost?" Hattie lifted her head. Her eyes caught the lantern light and didn't flinch. In that look there was caution, and something older than fear. Frontier men often mistook that kind of look for defiance. Elias had learned better. Defiance was a luxury. This was survival. "I'm not staying long," she said. Her voice held a careful English that wasn't her first tongue, but it was good enough to be understood without the awkwardness of a translator. She glanced toward the railroad stakes in the distance, as if she could smell their ink even from here. "If you're kind, you'll let me pass before the dark takes me." Elias stared at the ground near her boots. There were scuffs where she'd tried to stand and failed. The wrong kind of wrongness sat in his gut. She wasn't just hiding from weather. Someone had followed her. "What's your name?" he asked. Hattie didn't answer at once. She swallowed, and her throat bobbed in the lantern light. "Call me Hattie." It was a name that sounded like it belonged to a person born here, in a town where names were easy. Elias didn't challenge it. He'd seen men with better titles than honesty get themselves killed by asking the wrong questions. "What do you need?" he asked. Hattie's gaze flicked to his hands. Elias was still holding the lantern. He adjusted it so the light wouldn't show how he'd tightened his grip on the metal. "Heat," she said, "and water. After, I'll go." Elias considered the ways this could go bad. A stranger near his home could bring trouble, either the kind that wore a badge or the kind that wore a gun belt with no badge at all. He could already hear the railroad foreman's voice in his head, the way Marin Crowell always spoke like every word was a contract. Elias should have walked away. But the same wind that had made the valley sound like sleeping breath also carried a different kind of truth. Blood, thin and metallic, if you knew what to smell for. Hattie's sleeve had dried dark along the seam. Elias made his decision the way he made most decisions, with a grim sort of mercy. He stepped close enough now that she could see his face. "Come on," he said. "No one survives out here half broken." Hattie blinked, then tried to stand. Her knee trembled and she had to bite back whatever sound wanted to escape. Elias moved under her shoulder without grabbing. He offered, she accepted, and together they made a slow journey toward the porch. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, tallow, and the faint sweetness of dried herbs that Elias used for fever. He laid a blanket down near the bench. He heated water in a pot and then, after a pause that told her he wouldn't pretend this was normal, he fetched cloth. Hattie watched him carefully. As he unwrapped the stained sleeve, she held her jaw tight. There was a wound, deep, stitched badly by someone who didn't understand that stitch work could either save a life or bury it faster. Elias's hands were steady. He'd repaired hides and patched wagon sails, and those skills translated to skin in ways he didn't like to admit. He cleaned the wound with boiled water and astringent herbs. She flinched once, then forced stillness. When he found an embedded sliver of metal at the edge of the wound, Elias's stomach tightened. "Railroad men?" he asked, voice low. Hattie's eyes darkened. "Not the ones with surveyors," she said. "The ones who think land is only a thing to take." Elias wanted to ask more, but he didn't. Frontiers punished questions by turning them into evidence. He made a decision to keep her sheltered. He moved her belongings, what little she had, into a corner wrapped in an old feed sack. He hung her wet shawl near the stove to dry, then set a tin cup of warm water on the bench. Hattie drank with controlled desperation, like her thirst was an enemy she had to outlast. "You'll say you came in from the cold and I helped you," Elias said. "If anyone asks." Hattie's fingers tightened around the cup. "Who will ask?" Elias glanced toward the window. Outside, the dusk pressed close to the glass like a crowd. "Marin Crowell will," he said. "He checks on homesteads like he owns the thought of them." Hattie leaned back, careful. Marin Crowell. The name left her mouth with a sourness that tasted like memory. "Then you should lock your doors tonight." Elias didn't have a plan to lock doors against a company's men, but he had a plan to lock the fragile pieces of life that could be taken. He split kindling for a brighter fire, then fed it until the cabin glowed. While the flames crackled, Hattie sat as still as a listening animal. Elias noticed the fine beadwork on the edge of her shawl, small shapes that carried patterns he didn't know the meaning of, but respected the craft. She had calluses on her hands, not the hands of someone wealthy, and never the hands of someone helpless. At some point, the pain made her eyelids droop. She fought sleep with stubbornness until the fire warmed the room and the exhaustion finally won. Elias watched her breathe. He told himself he was keeping her alive out of simple decency. The truth was more complicated. Something about her eyes, about the way she looked at the corner where he'd set her satchel, felt like a tether. He couldn't say why. On the frontier, you learn to keep your heart in a cage, because every cage also kept out thieves. When the first stars appeared, Elias heard wagon wheels outside. A lantern beam passed across the cabin window. Footsteps followed, measured, certain, the kind that expected doors to open. Elias didn't move toward the front. He stayed where the shadow of the stove would protect him if needed. His hand rested near his rifle, not in display, but in readiness. A knock came, firm, with authority. "Rourke!" a man's voice called. "Open up! Marshal wants a word." Elias's mouth tightened. The marshal didn't ride out for a word at this hour unless the word was a verdict. He opened the door just enough to let the night's cold air rush in. Marin Crowell stood there with two of his survey crew, their coats stiff with dust. Marin wore his hat low like it could hide his eyes, but it didn't. "Evening, Marin," Elias said. Marin's gaze swept the cabin, sharp as a knife. "I'm not here for small talk," he said. "There's been talk of trouble at your place. Sabotage. Railroad property marked. Tools missing." Elias felt his jaw set. He hadn't stolen anything. He had fought off coyotes and patched fence wire and hauled water. The company men called it trouble whenever someone resisted their plans. "I've had no such trouble," Elias replied. Marin's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then you won't mind if we look?" Elias stood his ground. He could have allowed them in, could have played the role of cooperative homesteader. He also knew where cooperation ended, with someone else deciding what was inside his life. "You can look outside," Elias said, "if you want, but you don't come in." Marin's eyes flicked to Elias's shoulder. Elias saw it, the way the candlelight inside cast a softer glow near the bench where Hattie lay. Marin's gaze went straight to that warmth. "What's that?" Marin asked. Elias felt the air change. He didn't answer. He simply stepped slightly to block the window's line of sight. Marin took a step closer. One of his men shifted his weight, and the leather at his gun belt creaked. "You're hiding someone," Marin said, voice flat. "The company heard you took a drifter in." Elias's hand tightened on the doorframe. He could lie, he could bluff, but Hattie would be awake if footsteps moved wrong. He turned his face a fraction. "If you came to hurt her," he said quietly, "you'll have to do it with me in the way." Marin's nostrils flared. "Don't make threats," he said. "This is bigger than your pride. We've got a paper from the land office. We've got authority." The mention of paper struck Elias like a slap. Papers moved like storms. They didn't need horses. They came with stamps and signatures, and men who believed the world owed them ink. "What paper?" Elias asked. Marin reached into his coat and produced a folded sheet sealed with a wax impression. Elias didn't read it. He didn't need to. Marin's confidence told him what it was about. "The railroad's right-of-way," Marin said, "and the squatters who won't cooperate." Elias's breath came slow. He had been told more than once that the railroad would take what it wanted. He'd also been told, quietly when he ran into some of the survey men at the water trough, that there were other ways to make folks comply. Bribes, threats, framing. Marin glanced past him toward the cabin and then pointed. "Search the place," he ordered. Elias knew there was only one honest way to keep Hattie safe. He had to move her, now, while the men's attention was still inside the doorway. He turned his head just enough to look toward the stove glow. Hattie stirred, half awake. Their eyes met across the room, and in that gaze, Elias felt her ask silently whether he would betray her to save himself. He answered with action. He pulled a folded blanket from a hook, then crossed to the bench and lifted it over her shoulders without waking her fully. Hattie started to protest, but Elias silenced her with a look. Marin's men pushed into the cabin anyway, ignoring Elias's refusal like a child ignoring a warning sign. Elias stepped aside just enough to let them pass him, and then, while Marin's foreman gaze searched for evidence, Elias guided Hattie through the back wall where an old trap door led to a shallow root cellar. The cellar smelled of damp earth and stored apples, but it offered the one thing the frontier sometimes allowed: hiding places. Hattie's movements were swift, even injured. Elias felt the sting of her fear against his ribs as he lowered her down. He helped her into the corner behind the apples, then pulled the trapdoor shut. "Stay quiet," he whispered. Hattie's breath shivered. "If they find me—" Elias cut her off. "Then we'll burn the world down together," he said. It was a promise that sounded big. It would have to be enough. Marin's men continued searching. They lifted boards, poked at stored feed, and ran fingers through Elias's tools. Their eyes were the eyes of men who expected to be rewarded for finding guilt. Marin stepped deeper into the cabin, his boots leaving wet prints on Elias's floor. He moved toward the corner where Hattie's shawl hung drying. "Ah," Marin said, "so you didn't throw her out." Elias's stomach turned. He hadn't moved the evidence fast enough, but he also hadn't moved the truth away. Marin reached for the shawl, and Elias's hand shot out. "Leave it," Elias said. Marin froze for a fraction. Then he laughed, a dry sound. "You'd stop me?" Elias didn't answer. He knew the line between courage and stupidity. He chose the line that kept someone alive. Marin's foreman's badge caught the firelight when he turned his head. "Marshal will decide," he said, and then he yanked the shawl away from the hook. In the fabric, the beadwork flashed, and with it, Marin's face changed. He stared at the patterns as if he recognized a language written in color. Elias saw it too late. The way Hattie's shawl wasn't just clothing. It was identity, history, and warning. Marin's voice dropped. "You're Apache," he said. "I knew it." The words landed hard. Elias felt the frontier tilt. In towns like this, being Apache didn't only mean different culture. It meant being blamed for everything. Elias's rage rose fast, but he kept his voice steady. "She's a woman," he said. "She needs healing." Marin's eyes hardened. "Healing," he repeated, mocking the word as if it were a joke. "She's hiding because she stole something." He held up the shawl and turned it over, searching for something hidden in the lining. Elias's mind snapped into place. Hattie had been fleeing something. She'd come with a satchel. She'd had time to hide something once, maybe in her clothing. Marin's men fanned out, rummaging through the corner with a brutish urgency. Elias stepped forward, voice low. "You'll leave my cabin, Marin," he said. "Right now." Marin's gaze flicked to Elias's rifle rack. "If I leave," he said, "it'll be after the railroad has its proof." Then Marin turned back toward the shawl and reached into the seam. His fingers came out holding a folded scrap of parchment, creased and protected by thin oilcloth. Elias couldn't see the writing, but Marin's expression told the rest. The paper mattered. Marin smiled. "There it is," he said. Elias's heart thudded once, heavy. He understood too well now why Hattie had said she needed to pass quickly before dark. She wasn't just hurt. She was hunted for information. Marin called toward the back of the cabin. "Bring out the root cellar. We know you've got one." Elias's blood went cold. He hadn't been careful enough with the trap door. Marin had smelled it, or maybe someone had told him. Elias had a choice. Fight all of them and die for the sake of one stranger, or buy time and keep Hattie alive. The frontier did not reward noble stupidity. He moved slowly, eyes never leaving Marin. "You'll go home empty-handed," he said. Marin lifted his paper like a flag. "We're not here to be empty-handed," he replied. "We're here to make the land company whole." Then the marshal's name, invoked like a weapon, returned to Elias's ears. Elias didn't see the marshal, only the way Marin used official authority to do what he wouldn't dare admit in daylight. Marin's men yanked at the back wall. Wood creaked. The trap door opened. Hattie emerged in a blur of movement, too quick to be fully seen at first. She stood half behind the root cellar ladder, her face pale, her shawl slipping but her eyes sharp. She didn't look at Elias first. She looked at Marin, and something in her posture changed, like anger had finally found a target. Marin pointed the parchment toward her. "You see?" he said. "This is proof enough." Hattie's gaze dropped to the paper. She made no sound. Her mouth tightened, and Elias saw her swallow down a storm. Then she looked at Elias. Not as a rescued woman looked at a rescuer, as a person who knew rescue could be the start of a chain that ended in death. Hattie stepped up, carefully, ignoring the wound that would reopen if she moved too fast. She faced Marin with a steadiness Elias recognized in the best of his cattle, animals that didn't buck because they'd learned the ground could hurt you. "This paper isn't yours," Hattie said. Her English came slower now, heavier with emotion. "You didn't earn it." Marin scoffed. "Earn?" he repeated. "This is law." Hattie's eyes flashed. "Law is paper," she said. "Paper is hunger wearing a collar." Elias didn't know the words she used, but the meaning landed with the force of a kicked door. Marin's face hardened further. He stepped forward, and one of his men moved to grab Hattie's arm. Elias stepped between them, rifle still not raised. He kept his hands visible because he needed to look like a man trying to avoid violence, not a man starting it. "You don't touch her," Elias said. Marin's gaze went to Elias's face. For a moment, Elias saw calculation there. Not anger, not fear. A plan forming. "You're attached," Marin said softly. "That makes you responsible." He held up the parchment again. "The company claims right-of-way through this homestead," Marin announced to the cabin's small audience. "But there's a complication." His eyes shifted to Hattie. "This woman carries deeds, old deeds. Land allotment that's older than your fence lines, older than the company's surveyors. It says the land belongs to her people." Elias's throat tightened. He knew enough to understand what that meant. If Hattie truly carried proof, the railroad couldn't take the land without scandal, or without more violence disguised as justice. Marin leaned closer, voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "But her people weren't here," he said. "They were pushed off. They were scattered. The law says what's left becomes ours." Hattie's eyes filled, but she didn't let tears fall. "You mistake absence for permission," she said. Elias felt the truth of it like a stone in his gut. The frontier was built on absence and paperwork, and men who called theft necessity. Marin's smile returned, sharp. "So," he said, "we'll make it simple. We'll take the deeds and erase the dispute." Elias's hands shook once. He didn't like how the air felt, like the cabin had become a trap. He realized then the subversion of his own life. He had thought he was the rescuer, but the railroad had brought him into a larger game. Hattie wasn't just running from violence, she was carrying leverage, and leverage always got hunted. Marin gestured to his men. "Take the parchment. Take her." Elias moved before anyone touched Hattie. He lunged for the paper. The movement was fast, but his aim wasn't perfect. Marin jerked the parchment back and the paper tore slightly. Something in the torn edge caught Elias's eye. A stamped mark that didn't match Marin's claim. Elias blinked hard. The stamp looked newer than the document's language. A forgery. Or a tampered proof. Hattie saw it too. Her breath hitched once. Then she laughed, not with humor, but with a bitter recognition. "You were never looking for deeds," she said to Marin. "You were looking for a scapegoat." Marin's expression tightened. He turned the parchment over with quick, practiced motions, trying to hide the tear. But Elias had already seen enough. The railroad had brought men who knew where to dig. Marin had come with authority that wasn't meant to protect. It was meant to seize. Elias stepped closer, voice quiet and dangerous. "You made this," he said. Marin's eyes narrowed. "Made it?" Elias nodded toward the stamped seal. "That seal isn't of the time," he said. "You want the company to believe you found proof, but you forged it, and now you need a witness who can't speak." Marin stared at him, and Elias saw the foreman's rage boil under his careful face. "You don't know what you're talking about," Marin snapped. Hattie stepped forward, her wounded body moving with the stubbornness of a woman who had practiced endurance. She reached toward Marin but stopped short of his hands. "I know you," she said. "I've heard your voice at gatherings in the new town. I've watched how you look at people when you think no one's watching. You don't look like you work for the land. You look like you work for hunger." Marin's mouth twisted. "Enough!" Elias's heart hammered. He had to end this before someone fired a shot. Once a shot fired, the truth would be irrelevant. But he also needed to understand Hattie's past, and why she had fled with something important. When Marin's men hesitated, Elias used the moment to push Hattie back toward the corner, away from the door. He lifted the blanket to cover her legs again, like he could cover her fate with cloth. "Tell me what you're running from," he said to her quickly. Hattie's gaze moved between Elias and Marin, measuring the room like a map. "I was taken," she said, "for my people's name, for what they owned before they were chased." Elias listened, and the frontier noise outside fell away in his mind. He pictured the way companies operated, taking land, taking labor, taking records, taking the stories that proved the taking. Hattie continued. "They said my name would be safe if I carried paper," she said. "They said I would return home." Her voice trembled, and the tremble wasn't from cold. "But they sent men after me when I refused." Marin's eyes went hard. "You're lying," he said. Hattie didn't even glance at him. "You're the one who forged the stamp," she said. "You did it because the old records were held back for a reason. You couldn't find them yourself." Elias understood then. Hattie had genuine proof, or she had information that proved the company's claim was rotten. The railroad had targeted her because she carried something the company didn't have. Marin looked at Elias. "This man believes what she says?" he demanded, as if Elias's belief were a sickness. Elias's expression stayed steady. "I believe she needs me to keep her alive long enough for the truth to matter," he said. Marin's men shifted, and Elias could feel the moment where the room might explode. He raised his hand, palm out. Not surrender, but a barrier. "Before anyone gets hurt," Elias said, "you can take your men and go. You'll walk away and think about what you've done." Marin laughed again. "Walk away?" he said. "You think a railroad company walks away?" Elias's gaze went to the window. In the distance, the survey stakes looked like tally marks on a coffin. The cabin door creaked as another wagon approached, faster, rougher, with no careful authority. Elias heard the sound of hooves and the quick bark of someone shouting. A man Elias recognized from the homesteader lines, the old veteran, as the town called him, though Elias didn't believe age made someone old. The old veteran arrived with dust on his sleeves and anger in his eyes. "Marin," the old veteran shouted before he even dismounted. "What are you doing in Rourke's house?" Marin's face tightened with surprise. "This doesn't concern you," he snapped. The old veteran's eyes flicked to Hattie. He saw her injury, her beadwork, her pallor. His expression softened for half a breath, then hardened again with righteous fury. "It concerns anyone who believes in right," he said. Elias's muscles loosened slightly. The old veteran's presence changed the math. Men with nothing to lose could become witnesses. Marin stepped forward, trying to regain control. "We're enforcing the company's claim," he said. The old veteran snorted. "You're enforcing your own greed," he corrected. "I heard about your forged paper. I heard it from the woman you tried to buy with promises." Marin's eyes narrowed. "Who told you?" The old veteran tilted his chin toward Hattie. "Her word," he said. Hattie's shoulders trembled once. Elias saw her swallow and steady herself. Marin stared at Elias's cabin like it had betrayed him. "This is going to slow the work," he said. Elias's heart tightened. The work mattered less than people. Elias had always known that, but he'd been trying to prove he could survive without making enemies. Now he had made one enemy anyway. Marin turned his head and looked at the parchment again, as if he could argue it into being true. Then, to Elias's shock, Marin offered a quiet, controlled threat that wasn't the kind men made when they planned to fight. "You can keep her in your cabin," Marin said, "but you'll regret the trouble she brings. When the marshal comes with the order, you won't have a root cellar deep enough." The old veteran stepped toward him, blocking the door. "You think the marshal will believe you after this?" he asked. Marin's eyes flashed. "The marshal believes whoever rides in with papers," he replied. Hattie moved then, fast, controlled, as if her body knew what her mind couldn't afford to forget. She stepped past Elias, reached into her satchel hidden behind the feed sack, and pulled out a small bundle. She unfolded it and showed a different parchment. Thicker paper, older ink, a stamp Elias couldn't mistake. This one looked like it belonged to another generation. Marin stared, and for the first time he didn't look certain. Hattie's voice steadied. "The land title you want to steal is not hers," she said, and the word hers landed like a correction. "It never belonged to your company. It belonged to my grandmother, and before that, her grandmother. We were made to leave, but the record remains." Elias felt breathless. He stared at the parchment, then looked at Hattie's face. She was wounded, yet she was holding the truth with both hands like a shield. The old veteran exhaled hard through his nose. "That's the real thing," he said. Marin's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight as if deciding whether to fight or flee. Men who survived greed often chose what would cost less. He looked at Elias and his voice turned colder. "You've chosen sides," he said. Elias answered without hesitation. "I've chosen the side that keeps women alive," he replied. Marin's smile turned thin. "Then you'll learn what it costs," he said. He gathered his men and left the cabin. Their boots thudded in the dirt and then faded into the night like a rumor dissolving. Only after the wagon wheels disappeared did Elias realize how hard he'd been holding his breath. Hattie sank onto the bench, clutching the old title paper to her chest as if it could anchor her to the world. Elias moved toward her, but he didn't touch her right away. He offered his presence the way he'd offered the lantern earlier, carefully, as if she might still think kindness was a trick. "How long have you been carrying that?" Elias asked. Hattie's eyes stayed on him. "Long enough to keep it alive when I couldn't," she said. The old veteran stood by the doorway, arms crossed, watching them both. His gaze softened into something like approval. "I don't know your people's history," he told Hattie, voice gentler, "but I've seen enough to know you didn't come here for trouble." Hattie didn't answer him. Her attention remained fixed on Elias. Elias looked away first, because he felt suddenly exposed, like rescuing someone had pulled his hidden heart out into lantern light. Frontier men learned not to advertise longing. Elias had always lived as though his feelings were a liability. Now, though, he didn't want to hide. He fetched a second cup of water and sat beside her at a distance that still felt safe. "You're hurt," he said. "Let me see it again." Hattie's lips parted, and her first instinct was to refuse. Then pain shifted in her body like an argument too strong to win. Elias gently uncovered her sleeve again, moving with calm precision. He cleaned the wound and checked the stitches he'd patched earlier. The wound had begun to swell. He tightened the seam slightly, then wrapped it carefully with clean cloth. When he finished, Elias's hands hovered for a moment, hesitant. He wanted to comfort her with touch, but he didn't want to steal what she didn't offer. Hattie looked at him, and in her eyes Elias saw a question, whether he would keep choosing her after the danger passed. "You hid me," she said. "You didn't send me away." Elias exhaled. "I couldn't," he admitted. Hattie stared at the firelight in the hearth. "In my world," she said slowly, "a promise is a thing people break with consequences." Elias's chest tightened. "Then call it what it is," he said. "Not romance, not payment, just, I won't be a man who lets a woman bleed in the dirt." Hattie's mouth trembled at the corner. "That is still a kind of love," she said. Elias didn't know how to argue with the truth when it came from someone whose life had taught it to her. Outside, the valley quieted. The railroad wagon tracks would still be carved by morning. Marin would still return with orders. The company would still swallow land. But Elias had, for one night, refused to be swallowed along with it. The next day brought new danger and a different kind of hope. Elias woke before sunrise and checked the fence again. While he worked, Hattie moved quietly around the cabin, helping where she could. She wasn't delicate. She was tired, but she moved with purpose, making coffee, washing cloth in cold water, checking the pantry as if she could make herself useful enough to earn safety. Elias watched her for a while, noting how she avoided looking at the trap door. She didn't want to remember how close death had been. After the first meal, the old veteran rode in again with a small group of homesteaders, men and women who shared the thin line of fear that came from knowing the railroad would eventually claim them too. They had heard enough already. Marin had been caught searching for evidence, and Elias had shown that he was not a man who obeyed simply because someone shouted, "Law." Now, with Hattie's title in hand, the homesteaders had a reason to fight. Hattie stood at the table with the parchment spread between her hands. Elias sat across from her, not because he needed to, but because he wanted her to see that he stayed. The old veteran stood behind her, a guard without a gun. Elias listened while the homesteaders asked questions. Some asked them with respect. Others asked with the harsh curiosity of people who wanted their own fear to become someone else's blame. A woman named May, though May wasn't a main figure, she was one of the neighbors, spoke up about the valley boundary lines. "We've been paying taxes to a land office that never protected us," May said. "If that paper is true, We might stop them. Hattie looked at the parchment, then at Elias. It won't stop them, she said. Not for long. Paper only slows a hunger. Elias's jaw tightened. Then what will help? He asked. Hattie's gaze steadied. Truth plus witnesses, she replied. They can't take what everyone can point to. The old veteran nodded. We can be witnesses, he said. Hattie hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. But you must also understand this, she said. The railroad men will come back with more than papers. They'll come with debts, with threats. They'll come with men pretending to be friends. Elias felt the warning settle. He had already known the frontier's danger. The twist was that it wasn't only bullets. It was the slow violence of social pressure and false accusations. That afternoon, the railroad crew returned, but not the way Elias expected. Marin came with a different face, dressed cleaner, his posture more polished. He brought a man from town, someone Elias recognized by reputation, a former surveyor who now worked as an inspector for the company. Marin's voice carried as he arrived at Elias's homestead. Rourke, he greeted. We heard you've got papers. Elias stepped forward to meet him at the edge of the yard, where the sun made the dust glow. We heard you've got forgery, Elias replied. Marin's smile tightened. You make accusations? He asked. Elias nodded once. You came in the night looking for a scapegoat, he said. You found a frightened woman instead, and you decided to punish her for what she carries. Marin's gaze flicked toward the cabin window. Elias followed it and saw Hattie standing inside, partially hidden by the doorframe. Elias knew she was listening. Marin lowered his voice. You think you can protect an Apache woman with courage? He asked. Elias felt the insult cut deeper than any gun threat. In those words was the frontier's old lesson. Women like Hattie were never supposed to become the center of a story. Elias answered anyway. I can protect her with witnesses, he said. Marin laughed under his breath. Witnesses die, he said. Elias's chest burned. Not if we move careful. Marin's eyes hardened. Careful keeps you alive until it doesn't. Then Marin shifted his attention to Hattie's title paper, which the homesteaders had gathered around. You can show your proof to the town, he said, but I won't stop until the company secures what it's owed. Elias watched him, noticing the difference. Marin wasn't just threatening seizure, he was threatening inevitability. Hattie stepped out then, her injured arm wrapped again, her shawl hanging over her shoulders like a standard. She stood beside Elias and held her chin up. Marin looked at her and then at the beadwork. His lips pressed thin. You don't belong in this valley, Marin said. Hattie's answer came quiet, sharp. Neither do you, she said. The homesteaders murmured. Elias felt the air change into something electric. Marin's gaze turned to the old veteran. Your neighbors will suffer, he said. This is not a game. The old veteran's voice remained firm. So is it not, he replied. We'll meet you in town like civilized people. Marin's smile returned, but now it was a smile with teeth. See you in court, he said. Elias knew court was a different kind of frontier. It wasn't built of guns and horses. It was built of timetables and hired clerks and men who could make a lie sound like a fact. Still, the homesteaders had a reason to gather there. That night, Elias sat with Hattie by the fire. The crackle of the flames sounded like applause in a silent theater. Elias held a lantern, turning the light away from her injured sleeve. You spoke well in front of them, Elias said. Hattie stared into the fire. I didn't speak, she corrected. I answered. Elias let out a soft laugh despite everything. That's speaking, he said. Hattie's mouth curved faintly. For the first time since she'd appeared near the spring house, she looked less like a person waiting for death and more like someone who could imagine tomorrow. Elias felt his feelings shift under his ribs, slow and careful. He had the strange sensation of being seen, not by the town, by the person he'd rescued. Hattie reached for the edge of her shawl and pulled it closer. She hesitated, then asked a question that carried fear underneath it. Why did you help? She said. Elias swallowed. In the frontier, reasons had to survive the test of danger. He couldn't offer pretty answers. "Because I knew what it felt like to be hunted," he said. Hattie's gaze lifted. Elias looked down at his hands. "When the company first came," he continued, "they told me I'd be compensated. They told me if I cooperated, I'd be fine." He remembered the promise. He remembered the way a company could smile while it moved stakes into the ground. "They weren't fine," he said. "They were hungry." Hattie listened, and her expression softened into understanding. "And you," Elias said, voice quieter, "you were hunted with a woman's body. That makes it worse. It makes it personal." Hattie stared at him as if she might memorize the sound of his honesty. Then she nodded once. "When people push you out of your story," she said, "you become hard to reach. I expected you to become the kind of man who locks his door." Elias looked at her. "I did lock it," he admitted, "at first." Hattie's eyes widened slightly. "But then I heard you coughing behind the spring house," Elias continued. "And I thought, even if you were the devil, you didn't deserve to freeze." Hattie's breath caught. She looked away, and for a moment she seemed embarrassed by the tenderness in the room. Then she turned back and spoke a confession that made Elias's heart stop. "My past is not only violence," she said. "It's also a choice someone made for me." Elias waited. Hattie swallowed. "When I was younger, my people's leaders decided to send me with papers to bargain for safety. They believed if I carried records, the world would respect paper more than blood." Her fingers curled around the shawl edge. "But men like Marin see paper as a way to control women. They see identity as leverage." Elias felt a surge of protectiveness so intense it bordered on pain. "And the deed?" he asked gently. "Is it yours?" Hattie nodded. "It's mine to hold until I can return it," she said. "But I can't return it if you hand me over." Elias understood the fear beneath the sentence. He also understood the twist that the frontier always tried to impose. Help a woman, and the town would call you a fool. Protect her, and the town would call you guilty. Elias leaned forward, close enough that he could feel the warmth from her face. "I won't hand you over," he promised. Hattie's eyes shimmered. "Then I'll stay," she said. Elias blinked. "Stay?" Hattie's nod was small but fierce. "Not in your bed," she said quickly, as if she knew how men might misunderstand her. "Not as payment. I'll work. I'll help you keep this land, until we survive the railroad." Elias let out a breath he'd been holding for days. The resolution of her conditions wasn't just romance. It was a contract of respect. He reached out slowly and covered her hand with his. Her skin was warm, calloused, alive. "Then we'll survive," Elias said. The old veteran didn't interrupt. He only stepped outside after a time, leaving the two of them with the crackle of fire and the quiet bravery of hope. The court day arrived with a sky the color of wet ash. In town, people gathered as if watching a hanging. Elias walked with Hattie beside him, both of them under the same thin sun. The homesteaders formed a rough line like a shield. Marin and his men waited closer to the courthouse door, their posture relaxed in the way of men who expected justice to be delayed until it favored them. Elias felt the truth settle. The railroad didn't just want land, it wanted to teach everyone who stood in the way what fear tasted like. Inside the courthouse, ink and dust shared the same air. Marin presented his forged paper first. He held it up with confidence, speaking as if he owned words. The inspector, an oily man with clean nails, supported the lie with phrases about proper surveying and correct jurisdiction. Hattie stood silent while they spoke. When it was time for her to present the old title, she stepped forward and handed it to the clerk without tremor. The room quieted. Clerks loved paperwork. Papers were the frontier's smallest god. The clerk studied the seal, then called the inspector to examine it. The inspector's face tightened as he compared details. Elias watched Marin's eyes. He watched the foreman's confidence fracture into something more dangerous. Panic. The twist came not as a gunshot, but as a question. A juror, an older man with a scar on his lip, asked, "If this stamp isn't from the time Marin claims, Then why is it present on the other paper? Marin tried to answer quickly, but the inspector hesitated. Hesitation in court was like blood in snow. The clerk requested a comparison, and the forged document's edges were examined. The torn seam Elias had noticed now became the proof everyone could see. Marin's face went pale. He had expected Elias to be alone. He had expected Hattie to be dismissed as a woman without credibility. He had expected prejudice to do his work for him. But the frontier held more complexity than he counted. Hattie spoke only once, her voice calm. "My people were pushed out," she said. "But records don't forget. Men who forge records do." When the judge asked about Elias's involvement, Elias answered plainly. "I helped her because she was injured," he said. "I didn't know her past. I still chose to keep her alive." The judge's expression tightened. Elias saw something he didn't expect there: respect for stubborn decency. Outside the courthouse, the town buzzed. People argued and whispered. Some looked at Hattie like she was proof of their fear. Others looked at her like she was proof of something better. Marin stormed away without the satisfying ending Elias might have wanted. The frontier didn't do clean conclusions, but it offered a different kind of win. The court postponed the railroad seizure pending verification of titles. It wasn't a permanent victory, but it was a pause, a crack in the wall where air could get in. Hattie exhaled hard once the crowd shifted away. She leaned against Elias's shoulder, and for a moment, she didn't look like someone surviving. She looked like someone finally tired. Elias's arm came around her carefully. "Hattie," he said softly. She looked up at him, and in that look, Elias felt the slow burn of something he didn't have words for yet. He expected gratitude. He expected duty. He didn't expect the tenderness to become a desire for a future. Later that evening, when the town's arguments had turned into crickets and candle smoke, Elias brought Hattie back to the homestead. The cabin looked the same: wood smoke, patched floorboards, the stove's stubborn heart. But the air inside felt different. The firelight warmed the shadows as if the room had learned a new story. Hattie sat by the table with the title paper wrapped safely again. Elias fetched a bottle of coffee beans and brewed something stronger than the day's worry. He offered her a mug. She accepted with both hands. "Do you think you'll go back to your people?" Elias asked. Hattie stared into the coffee. "Someday," she said. "Not soon. Not until the railroad can't pretend it never met the truth." Elias nodded. "Then we'll hold the line," he said. Hattie looked up. "Not with guns," she replied. "With stubbornness." Elias's mouth curved faintly. "I can do stubborn," he said. Hattie smiled then, small, genuine, a rare thing in a life built from escape. Elias took a seat across from her. He watched her hands, calloused, steady now, no longer trembling. He remembered the first night, the way she'd sat in the weeds with blood drying on cloth. He didn't want to romanticize suffering, but he also refused to pretend that saving someone was not also a kind of love. He leaned forward, voice quiet. "I didn't know what you carried," he said. "I only knew you were in danger." Hattie's eyes held his. "And now?" she asked. Elias felt his heart speak before his pride could stop it. "Now," he said, "I want to know the rest of your story, the one where you don't have to run." Hattie's breath caught. She looked down briefly, as if fearing hope would burn her. Then she reached across the table and touched Elias's wrist with her fingertips. Her touch was warm and deliberate. "I can't promise the road will be easy," she said. "I don't need easy," Elias replied. "I just need true." Hattie's eyes shimmered. "Then be true with me," she said. Elias stood slowly, offering his hand. Hattie rose as well, and for the first time since he'd found her at the spring house, her movements were fully hers. They didn't rush. The frontier romance wasn't built in stolen kisses. It was built in shared heat, shared danger, and the decision to keep choosing one another after the world tried to take the choice away. Elias guided her to the bed where a spare blanket had been kept ready. He offered her space and dignity, and Hattie accepted with a nod instead of fear. When the night settled, the wind still worried the sage. Railroad stakes still stood in the distance like threats. Marin Crowell might still return with more paperwork and more men. But in the cabin's firelight, Elias and Hattie built something the railroad couldn't measure. A home held by consent, courage, and truth. And before sleep took her, Hattie pressed her forehead to Elias's chest, whispering words that sounded like a vow. Not to the court, not to the company, to the man who had turned back toward danger instead of away from it. The next morning would bring another day of dust and risk, but the love between Elias and Hattie had already made its quiet, irreversible mark on the frontier. Slow burn, wary, real, until winter and paperwork could no longer erase what they'd survived together.